They called him the monster. In the heart of a silver city that floated above a dying sun, behind glass walls thicker than steel, a single human sat alone. The light was always too bright, the air too thin, and the silence too loud. To the alien scientists of the Zorth Dominion, he was not a man, just a sample, an odd relic from a broken world. They studied him like an animal. They measured his pulse, his breath, his brain waves. And when he screamed, they recorded it. His name was Mason Hale, though no one spoke it anymore. To them, he was simply Subject 9, the last of his kind. The Zorth had conquered 1,000 worlds before Earth. They enslaved entire species with ease, giants made of crystal, shapeshifters of smoke, insectoid hives that once devoured moons. Every one of them knelt, bent, and obeyed. But Earth had been different. Humans didn't kneel easily. They didn't know when to quit. Even when the sky burned red and the oceans boiled, they fought. They fought with sticks when the guns were gone, with fists when the sticks broke, with teeth when the fists failed. The Zorth didn't understand that kind of madness. So when the last surviving human was captured, they didn't destroy him. They decided to keep him, to understand why his species had fought to the last breath. They wanted to dissect what made humans so resistant to submission. They wanted to study the monster in his natural form. Mason sat in his cage, staring at the shimmering city beyond the glass. Ships drifted like silent sharks in the yellow sky. He had been in this cell for years, maybe 5, maybe 50. Time didn't work the same way here. He was thin now, scarred and unshaven, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp. The scientists came every day. Different shapes, different colors, some with long limbs, others made of glimmering metal. They spoke in cold, mechanical tones. Sometimes they asked him questions through a translator drone. Do you feel pain? Why did your people resist? Why didn't humanity accept integration? He always answered the same way. Because we don't like being owned. They would buzz, record, and leave. They never understood that answer. To them, the galaxy was a chain. Every world had its place. Every race had its task. Order was peace. Control was harmony. Freedom was chaos. To humans, that sounded like hell. Mason had seen what the Zorth did to Earth. He had watched them burn cities, erase histories, rewrite truth. He had watched people kneel not out of worship, but out of fear. He had seen children with collars that glowed red when they cried. He didn't cry anymore, he couldn't. But he remembered. Every experiment, every humiliation, every laugh from those gray-skinned tyrants carved another promise into his bones. One day, I'll make you understand what fear really is. One day, a young alien scientist, curious and naive, tapped on the glass. Through the translator, he asked, "Why do you glare? You cannot escape. The Zorth are forever." Mason looked up slowly. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind that makes predators hesitate. "Nothing forever," he said softly. The alien frowned, not understanding. It turned away, writing something in its floating tablet. The others laughed when it told them what the humans said. To them, it was nonsense. Every species said words like that before they were crushed. But none of them had been human. Later that night, when the lights dimmed and the scientists left, Mason whispered to himself. Words from a language no one else knew. Words of home. We're not gone, not yet. He closed his eyes and remembered Earth, the wind, the noise, the laughter. He remembered his daughter running barefoot through the grass, shouting that she could catch the stars. And then he remembered the fire that fell from the sky, and the silence that followed. They thought they had broken him. They didn't know they had only taught him patience. He pressed his hand against the glass. It was cold, smooth, perfect, unbreakable. He smiled again, that small, dangerous smile. The Zorth had conquered the galaxy. They believed they had ended humanity. But they hadn't killed what made humans terrifying. They hadn't killed hope. And in that silent cell, far from the blue world that birthed him, Mason Hale began to plan. Because monsters don't stay in cages forever. The Zorth scientists thought humans were amusing. They had captured the last one, put him in a glass cage, and made him their favorite joke. To them, Mason Hale wasn't dangerous. He was weak, soft, and slow. He was the punchline of every conversation in the lab. They would gather around his enclosure, their silver eyes blinking, their hands holding glowing tablets. They'd tap the glass and watch him react, like children staring at a zoo animal. "The creature stares again," one said. "I think it tries to think," another replied. "Impossible, it's primitive." They laughed, that strange, clicking laugh that echoed off the metal walls. But Mason didn't look away. He never did. He just stared at them, silent, studying every movement, every tool, every word. They thought he was simple. They didn't realize he was learning. His cage was surrounded by technology he barely understood. Floating drones buzzed overhead, scanning him. Panels on the walls flashed with alien symbols. Doors opened with light instead of locks. He watched it all and remembered. Humans had built things once too. Machines that touched the sky. Weapons that split atoms. He didn't understand this alien technology, not yet, but he could feel it. The same logic, the same rhythm. Machines were machines, and all machines had weaknesses. The aliens enjoyed their work. They recorded every word Mason spoke. Sometimes they even asked him questions to test his cognitive limits. One day, one of the scientists leaned close to the translator and asked, "Do humans fear death?" Mason looked at it for a long moment. Then he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who already knew the answer to the universe's cruelest question. "No," he said softly, "we bring it." The translator repeated his words in their sharp, electronic language. The scientists looked at each other, confused. Then they laughed again. "He thinks he is a killer. A single human cannot harm the Zorth Dominion. We conquered 1,000 worlds before his species even made fire." They thought it was funny. Mason didn't. That night when they left, he sat in the darkness of his cell and whispered to himself. He didn't speak to anyone. There was no one left to hear him. But he spoke anyway. "They don't understand," he murmured. "They never do." He closed his eyes and pictured the faces of his people, soldiers, workers, dreamers, who had all refused to kneel. They weren't perfect, humanity never was. But they had heart. That impossible thing the Zorth would never understand. Heart couldn't be measured. It couldn't be studied. It couldn't be controlled. Mason noticed something new the next morning. While the scientists laughed, a group of other beings passed through the lab, slaves from other conquered worlds. They moved silently, carrying tools, cleaning equipment, bits of broken machinery. One of them, a tall, insected creature with 6 arms and glowing orange eyes, stopped to look at him. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the glass. Mason didn't move, but he nodded once. A small, almost invisible gesture. The creature froze, confused. Then, after a moment, it nodded back before hurrying away. The aliens didn't notice. They never noticed the small things. But Mason did. That was the first time someone had acknowledged him in years. Not as a subject, not as a thing. As a person. And in that tiny nod, something stirred, something dangerous. Hope. The Zorth continued their experiments, unaware that the seed had been planted. They joked about the human every day. They shared recordings of him among their colleagues, mocking his primitive body, his dull eyes, his pointless rage. They called him the joke of the galaxy. A failed species. A forgotten mistake. But jokes have a way of turning on those who tell them. Late one cycle, as Mason sat in his cell, he noticed something flicker in the control panel near the glass. A spark, small, quick, almost invisible. A power surge. A glitch. He smiled to himself. The Zorth believed machines were perfect. But humans knew better. Everything broke eventually. And all it took was one broken thing to start a chain reaction. He pressed his hand against the glass again. This time not as a prisoner, but as a man waiting for the right moment. Because Mason Hale wasn't going to die in a cage. Not yet. Not before he made them remember what a human could do. The Zorth Dominion believed fear was the strongest chain in the universe. They ruled through terror. Entire civilizations bent their knees to avoid extinction. But fear has limits, and humans were never very good at staying afraid. In his glass cell, Mason Hale had become a story. At first, just whispers. A strange rumor passed between the alien slaves who worked in the laboratories. They said the human never bowed, that he stared back at his masters, that he smiled at death. To the Zorth, Mason was a harmless curiosity. To the enslaved, he was something else entirely, a reminder. The first spark came from a worker named Terk, a reptilian miner from the ice world of Jothra. His people had been conquered 3 centuries ago. They were obedient now, their spirit long gone. But one day, while cleaning the lab floors, Terk heard Mason laugh. Not a weak laugh, not a mad one. A real laugh. It startled him so much he dropped his tools. He turned toward the glass cell. The human was sitting cross-legged, staring at the ceiling, laughing quietly to himself. The Zorth scientists ignored it, too busy arguing over data charts. When the room emptied, Terk whispered, "Why do you laugh, human? They torture you, you have nothing left." Mason looked up, his face thin but alive. "That's why I laugh," he said softly, "because I still can." Terk didn't understand at first, but something in those words stayed with him. It felt dangerous. The next few cycles, Mason started to test his cage, not with force but with words. When the scientists mocked him, he mocked them back. When they insulted his species, he grinned and said, "You're right, we're terrible. We built weapons just to see how loud they could be." The scientists found this fascinating. They called it primitive humor. But the slaves who overheard him didn't think it was funny. They thought it was brave. They began talking about him in secret. The human who laughed at the masters. The one who wasn't afraid. And in a galaxy ruled by fear, that idea was poison. One night when the guards changed shifts, Terk came close to Mason's glass cage. He moved carefully, pretending to sweep. "Human," he whispered, "they say your world is dead. Why do you still resist?" Mason looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were tired but fierce. "Because I'm not dead yet," he said. "And as long as one of us breathes, it's not over." Terk didn't know what to say. He just nodded and walked away, but something inside him burned for the first time in centuries. Word spread. Quietly, patiently, like a spark under dry grass. Among the slave races, the human became a symbol. They began to share stories, some true, some not. They said he'd fought an army barehanded. They said he'd killed 10 Zorth before they captured him. They said he knew the secret name of the stars. Mason never claimed any of that. He didn't have to. He just kept surviving, watching, waiting. The Zorth laughed at the rumors. But the laughter grew thinner each day. Something was changing. Something they couldn't measure or predict. Then came the breaking point. A Zorth scientist entered the lab with 2 guards and a chained alien woman, small, with translucent skin and trembling hands. She had failed her work quota, and they brought her here for punishment. Mason watched as the scientist raised a shock baton. The woman screamed as electricity surged through her. Mason slammed his fist against the glass. "Stop," he roared. The scientist turned, surprised. "You speak for her." "I speak because you woe," Mason shouted. His voice shook the room. "You think pain keeps people loyal? You think fear lasts forever? It doesn't, it breaks. And when it breaks, so will you." The scientist laughed and struck the woman again. But this time, the other slaves in the room didn't stay silent. One dropped his tools, another hissed. And Terk stepped forward. He grabbed the shock baton from the scientist's hand and drove it straight into his chest. The guards fired, killing Terk instantly. The lab fell into chaos. But in that moment Mason smiled, a sad, proud smile. Because one act of defiance had just lit the fuse. When they dragged Terk's body away, the Zorth thought they'd restored order. But that night across the Dominion, whispers spread faster than light. "The human has spoken. The chains will break. The monster will rise." And in his glass cage, Mason Hale sat in silence, eyes glowing with quiet fury. He didn't need to fight yet. Not yet. Because the galaxy had just remembered what humans do best. They inspire others to fight back. The Zorth Dominion didn't believe in miracles. They believed in control. Every door, every thought, every breath in their empire was counted, logged, and owned. So when the incident happened, the death of a scientist by a slave's hand, they thought it was a small glitch, a random act, a mistake. They didn't know it was the beginning of their end. Mason Hale sat in the dim light of his cell. The blood of Terk's rebellion was still fresh in his mind. He could see the look in the alien's eyes, that final spark of freedom before the guards cut him down. That look haunted Mason, but it also gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Terk had believed in him. Others would too. But first he had to get out. He studied the room the way a wolf studies a trap, slowly, patiently. Every detail mattered. The hum of the energy shield, the timing of the patrol drones, the moments when the lights flickered. Every shift, every pattern, he memorized it all. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but he was human, and humans were built to adapt. On the next rotation, a guard entered the lab. A big Zorth soldier, armored in black plates and arrogance. He carried a plasma rod, the kind that could turn bone into ash. Mason sat still, pretending to sleep. The guard stepped inside his enclosure to replace a power cell, an action he had done 100 times before without fear. That was his mistake. When the door hissed open, Mason moved. Fast. He lunged from the shadows and slammed his shoulder into the alien's chest. The guard stumbled back, surprised, too surprised. Mason ripped the plasma rod from his grip. The alien hissed, reaching for a weapon, but Mason didn't give him the chance. He swung the rod once, a brutal, perfect strike. There was a flash of blue light. The guard fell. Silence followed. For the first time in years, Mason stood outside the glass, free. He stared down at the dead Zorth. His chest was heaving, his body shaking not from fear, but from realization. He had just killed one of them. He could kill them. He didn't waste time. He stripped the guard's access band and snapped it onto his own wrist. The translator implant still worked, glowing faintly. He grabbed the alien's sidearm, checked its power cell, and looked toward the hallway beyond. The lab was empty for now. The others would come soon. He needed chaos before then. Mason moved to the control console and began pressing buttons he didn't fully understand. Alarms blared, lights flickered, containment doors opened across the facility. All the other cages. All the other prisoners. Screams filled the halls not of fear, but of confusion, anger, freedom. He turned toward the glass cells and saw faces, reptilian, insectoid, mechanical, all staring back at him in disbelief. He raised the plasma rod. "You want to be free," he shouted. Then stop waiting for permission. And just like that, the fire spread. Guards flooded the corridors. Blaster fire lit the air. Mason ducked behind a console, returning shots wildly. His hands shook, but his aim held true. Every kill felt like revenge for a world already gone. He saw a young alien, barely grown, cowering in a corner, the same species as Terk. Mason tossed him the fallen guard's weapon. "Fight," he said. The boy hesitated, then nodded. And for the first time in Zorth history, a slave fired back. By the time the reinforcements arrived, the lab was burning. Bodies littered the floor. The once sterile walls were scorched black. Mason was gone, vanished into the vents, into the dark, leaving only one message burned into the control console screen. "We are still here." Across the Dominion, the news spread like a plague. One human, had killed a Zorth soldier and escaped. It was impossible, unthinkable. But the slaves didn't care about impossible. They whispered his name like a prayer. They painted it on walls, scratched it into metal. Mason Hale. The human. The monster in the cage. The Zorth wanted to erase him. Instead, they made him a legend. That night, under the red glow of burning laboratories, Mason looked out from the cliffs above the city. He could see the stars, faint but familiar. He smiled. Not because he was safe, he was. Not because he had won, not yet. He smiled because he knew the truth. For all their ships, all their weapons, all their power, the Zorth had made one mistake, they could never undo. They had reminded the galaxy what a human really was. The Zorth Dominion had always believed rebellion was impossible. They thought fear was enough to keep a galaxy silent. But fear is a strange thing. It burns out when you push people too far. And now, because of one human, the galaxy was on fire. It began with whispers, rumors of the human who killed his masters and vanished into the night. At first, no one believed it. How could one man from a species long extinct do what entire armies could? But then the stories grew. They said he freed others. They said he wore the armor of the Zorth he killed. They said he fought with fire in his eyes and a smile on his face. The Zorth tried to silence the rumors, but words travel faster than ships. And everywhere those words reached, something inside the slaves began to change. On the mining world of Durek 4, a group of chained workers refused to kneel. They overpowered their guards using drills and tools. When asked why they rebelled, one of them shouted, "The human showed us how." On the water world of Enketh, an enslaved species of fish-like beings tore apart their masters' laboratories. They painted Mason's name in red blood across the walls. In the gas colonies of Varlon, slaves hijacked ships and escaped into deep space. They carried one symbol on their hulls, a handprint. 5 fingers. One species. Human. The Zorth Council panicked. They declared a state of war. They sent fleets to crush the uprisings. But the rebels didn't fight like armies. They fought like humans. Small groups, fast strikes, vanishing into shadows. They sabotaged supply lines. They destroyed communication towers. They used every scrap, every broken machine, every weakness they could find. And somewhere in the chaos, Mason Hale moved like a ghost. He didn't command. He inspired. He didn't lead armies. He lit matches. One night, deep in the ruins of a burned laboratory, Mason gathered a small group of freed slaves. Terk's people were among them, scaly, scarred, but unbroken. They looked to him for guidance. He looked tired, older, but his eyes burned brighter than ever. "You all know what they are," he said quietly. "They think we're less than them. They think we're tools, but they've forgotten what happens when tools turn into weapons." A reptilian female hissed softly. "They have fleets, worlds, fire that can melt cities. What do we have?" Mason smiled. "Anger, hope, and each other." He looked at their frightened faces and leaned closer. "That's more than enough." Within weeks, the rebellion turned into a movement. Hundreds of worlds rose up. The Zorth responded with fire, burning entire colonies to ash. But every time they crushed one uprising, 2 more appeared. It was chaos. It was unstoppable. And the galaxy began to realize what the Zorth feared most. They could be beaten. On the broadcast networks that spanned the stars, hacked transmissions began to appear. A shadowed figure, speaking in a strange human tongue that most species didn't even understand. The words were always the same. "You can kill one man, but you can't kill the idea that freedom is worth dying for." Every time the message appeared, new uprisings followed. The Zorth tried to find the source. They never could. Mason traveled from world to world in secret ships. He trained others how to fight. He showed them how to make weapons from scrap, how to strike from the dark, how to think like humans. And when someone asked him why he kept going, why he didn't rest, he simply said, "Because they haven't paid enough yet." He carried a small piece of earth with him, a torn photo, faded and burned, showing a little girl running through grass under a blue sky. His daughter, his reason. The Zorth High Command began to speak his name with dread. The human plague, they called him. The death seed. The monster from the cage. And still, no one could find him. He was everywhere and nowhere. A shadow in the dark. A ghost with fire in his veins. By the time the Dominion realized the truth, it was too late. Their fleets were stretched thin. Their slave worlds were gone. Their factories had fallen silent. Their soldiers began to desert, whispering the same words as the rebels. We are still here. In the silence after another burning city fell, Mason stood on a high cliff looking at the stars. Each one of those lights was a world once enslaved, now free. He didn't smile this time. He just whispered to himself, "It's not over yet, not until they remember what they did to us." The fire was spreading, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the Zorth Dominion felt something they had never felt before. Fear. The galaxy was burning. For decades, the Zorth Dominion had ruled with iron and fire. Now their ships drifted like broken bones in space, their once mighty worlds filled with smoke and rebellion. The old order was dying, and the name that haunted their dreams was whispered like a curse. Mason Hale, the last human, the monster they created. The rebellion had grown beyond anything Mason ever imagined. Worlds he had never seen now fought under banners painted with his symbol, a single human handprint. What had started as a spark in a laboratory cage had become a wildfire that consumed empires. Yet victory came at a cost. Whole cities burned. Millions died. And Mason was tired. He stood aboard an old warship, once a Zorth cruiser, now captured and repurposed. Its name had been changed. In rough letters scorched into the hull, it read, "Freedom's Echo." The bridge lights flickered as the ship drifted toward the last target, the Zorth homeworld. Zorth Prime. He stared out at the planet through the viewing window. It was huge and silver, covered in storm clouds and defense grids. The air around it glowed with the light of energy shields. Thousands of rebel ships gathered behind him, a fleet of mismatched vessels, old, patched, stolen, but united. It was the moment everything had led to. Beside him, a reptilian officer bowed her head. "Human," she said softly, "if we attack, billions may die." Mason nodded slowly. "I know. And if we do..." He turned his gaze back to the planet. "Then we die slowly and they'll rise again. No, we end this now." The Zorth broadcast filled the fleet's comms. A deep, cold voice echoed across the channels. "This is Supreme Commander Varkas of the Dominion. Human, surrender, you cannot destroy us. You are one man, a mistake that should have died with your world." Mason leaned closer to the comm. His voice was calm, low, and steady. "You're right," he said. "I am one man, but I'm the mistake that remembers." He cut the line. When the first volley hit the shields of Zorth Prime, the sky turned white. Rebel ships surged forward, firing every weapon they had. The Dominion's fleets rose from orbit like a storm of knives. The battle began. Explosions painted the void. Ships burned and shattered. The air filled with static and screams. Mason's cruiser dove through the fire, shaking with every hit. He gripped the console as alarms screamed around him. "Push through," he shouted. "Hit the generators." The Freedom's Echo roared toward the defense grid. Plasma bolts tore through the hull. The ship's wings shattered. Mason's crew, humans, reptilians, insectoids, and beings of light, fought side by side. None of them expected to survive. None of them cared. They weren't fighting for life anymore. They were fighting for meaning. When the shields finally cracked, the rebel fleet poured through like blood through an open wound. Zorth Prime was exposed. Mason's voice echoed through every ship. For the fallen, for the free, for the ones they thought were weak. The fleet descended. Cities burned beneath them. The great towers of the Dominion crumbled. The Zorth screamed their rage into the sky, but it was too late. The galaxy had come for them. As Mason's ship neared the capital spire, he stood from his chair. Though others tried to stop him. "Human, the surface is suicide." He smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said, "it usually is." He took a plasma rifle, a fragment of armor, and walked to the dropship bay. When the hatch opened, fire and wind roared inside. He looked down at the world that had enslaved the stars. "You called me a monster," he whispered. "You were right." Then he jumped. He landed hard amid the burning ruins. The sky was red. The air smelled of ash and metal. Zorth soldiers surrounded him, weapons raised. Their leader, Varkas, stepped forward, a towering alien in black armor. "You think this changes anything?" Varkas hissed. "You are dust, human." Mason raised his rifle, blood on his face, fire in his eyes. "No," he said quietly, "I'm the match." He fired. The spire exploded behind them, light flooding the sky. From orbit, the rebel fleet watched as Zorth Prime went silent. Then came the transmission. Mason's voice, broken but clear, filled every channel in the galaxy. "You called us monsters, you tried to break us. But we are the storm that comes after fear. We are human. Remember that." And then the signal ended. When the fires died, the Zorth Dominion was gone. Their homeworld was ash, their fleet scattered. But the name Mason Hale would never fade. Some said he died in that final blast. Others believed he lived, still watching from the shadows of the stars. Either way, the message he left behind became the new law of the galaxy. Never cage a human. They don't stay inside for long. The war was over. The Zorth Dominion, once the masters of 1,000 worlds, was gone. Their fleets were wrecks drifting in space, their cities silent and cold. For the first time in living memory, the galaxy was free. And the name whispered on every world, every station, every breath of wind was the same. Mason Hale, the last human, the monster who destroyed monsters. Across the stars, people spoke of him like a myth. On the ice world of Jothra, where Terk's people lived, children built statues of a man holding a torch. They said it was the Firebringer. On the gas colonies of Varlon, pilots painted his handprint on their ships and said it brought luck. On the old slave worlds, where chains once clattered across stone, the freed people sang songs in a strange old human language, though none of them knew what the words meant. But they all knew what he stood for. Defiance, freedom, hope. No one knew what happened to him. Some said he died in the fire over Zorth Prime, his body vaporized in the final explosion. Others swore they saw him in the ruins weeks later, helping survivors before vanishing into the night. Rumors spread faster than light. The galaxy didn't care if they were true. It needed to believe that somewhere, the humans still watched from the dark, ready to rise again if tyranny ever returned. Years passed. The broken races of the galaxy came together for the first time, not out of fear, but out of respect. They formed a new council on a neutral world. Not a throne of power, but a circle of equals. The chair once reserved for the ruler of the Zorth Dominion sat empty, untouched. A single inscription was carved into the stone beneath it. For humanity, the ones who would not kneel. Every being who walked into that hall saw those words and remembered the cost of freedom. But peace is not easy. Old wounds don't close overnight. The galaxy had been built on fear for too long. Some races still hated each other, others wanted revenge. And in those dark corners where bitterness grew, a new kind of whisper began to spread. We need another human. They didn't mean it literally. They meant they needed that same courage, that same madness that let a single man fight an empire. And slowly, that courage started to appear again. A generation later, on a small world of blue oceans and green forests, a ship landed quietly. Inside it, a group of explorers stepped out, descendants of the freed races, searching for lost worlds. The planet was strange. Its air was rich, its gravity perfect. And in its soil, they found ruins. Metal twisted by time. Stone walls carved with letters no one could read. And among them, a single plaque half buried in dust. They cleaned it carefully, and the words came to life. Earth, home of humanity. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved through the grass like a sigh. This is where he came from, whispered one of the explorers. The human. They stood in silence, as if afraid to breathe. And then, one by one, they knelt, not in worship but in respect. Back among the stars, a new age began. The galaxy called it the Dawn Era. An age of rebuilding, learning, and freedom. Every year, on the day the Dominion fell, the people of 1,000 worlds turned off their machines and lit fires instead. Some lit candles. Some lit torches. Some simply sat beneath the stars. They called it Human Night, the night they remembered the one who burned the chains. Legends said that sometimes, in the deepest reaches of space, A signal still echoed through old frequencies. A voice, faint, broken by static, but clear enough to hear one last message. You can cage a body. You can break a world. But you'll never kill the human heart. The signal always ended the same way, soft laughter fading into silence. And somewhere far from any world, a ship drifted quietly through the dark. Inside it sat a man, older now, scarred but alive. He looked out at the stars and smiled. The galaxy had changed, the fire had spread. He didn't need to lead anymore. He didn't need to fight. His work was done. He whispered to the stars, as if speaking to ghosts. You see, kiddo, I kept my promise. And on his lap, wrapped carefully in old cloth, was a faded photograph. A little girl running barefoot through grass under a blue sky. Mason Hale closed his eyes and finally rested. Because the galaxy was free. And the monsters were afraid again. The last human was gone, but his fire lived on, in every world, every rebel heart, and every soul that dared to whisper in the dark. We are still here,